We now visit with GOP political strategist, also the host of Mac on Politics podcast. It's Matt Mackowiak. Matt, good morning. How are you?
Hey, Chad. I'm doing great. Good morning.
Thanks for coming on the show today. Let's start off with the big win last week for Republicans, or at least it appears as though it's a win for Republicans in the House. I think both sides are blowing it out of proportion a little bit because the Senate's going to completely rewrite the House version of the bill. I mean, what we're going to end up with is nothing like what we're seeing right now, correct?
Yeah, I don't know that it's completely different. I think there will be some elements that will be similar. But I do think that both sides are making too much of it. I mean, it's clear the House had to pass something. They had to get a vehicle over to the Senate. This was the best that they could do under that process, and without the kind of consensus that they would generally want in their caucus. But I also think Democrats saying, the House majority's gone and this is a disastrous vote for Republicans. I'm not necessarily sure that's the case either, because if the bill does look, one of two things will happen: either the Senate doesn't pass something, and nothing fundamentally changes, in which case it will be hard for Democrats to make the argument to voters that Republicans harmed their health care. Or it does pass, and if it passes from the Senate, it'll be a different bill, and it'll be something that, that the attacks would be different, potentially, depending on the substance of the bill. And so the House bill won't matter, because the ultimate bill is the bill that will affect Americans. So I just think, everybody wants to talk about the midterms right now. The midterms are 18 and a half months away. The political environment's going to be very different at that time, and we have to see how healthcare plays out. It's going to be months before the Senate is able to do anything, I think.
What do you think? It's never easy. Passing legislation, getting things done in Washington is never easy. What are the chances of something getting done that both the Senate and the House can agree to? Because you can't lose many members in the House, and the Senate almost, they've got to do something that balances the Freedom Caucus and the Tuesday Morning Group and then their own people as well. I mean, this seems like it's going to be a pretty tough deal to pull off.
It does. It's definitely not guaranteed by any means. I mean, you can only lose 2 Republicans in the Senate. If you lose 3, you don't have 50 votes. You can't pass the bill. That's a problem. And right now, it's not clear that Rand Paul would be willing to support something that you could also get support from someone like Susan Collins of Maine or Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, 2 of the more moderate members in the Republican caucus in the Senate. So, look, this is a step-by-step process. We have to see what happens with the Senate bill. The Senate bill is not going to get jammed down the House, I don't think. I think they'll go to a conference committee and work out the differences. That's why this process is really a long ways off. I mean, the Senate is going to go through Senate committees and markups and a CBO score, and there's going to be a floor process with amendments and votes. I mean, you're talking about months, literally months. And that's just to move a Senate bill. Then you go to a conference committee, then it has to pass both houses again. So, again, I think we're a ways off. You're right, though. I mean, just because they passed the first step doesn't mean that this is definitely going to happen. There's still a lot of hurdles they have to get over.
I believe there was a lawmaker, it was either this morning or yesterday morning, who said that don't look for the Senate to pass anything before 2018, and don't look for it until after the midterms. What do you think? Is that likely or unlikely?
Well, we'll know a lot, I think, probably by September. I think the summer will be an important period of time in the Senate. Do the committees begin having actual hearings? Does legislative text start coming out? Can they get a CBO score? Can they get a bill out of the Health Committee, the Health, Education, Labor, Pensions Committee, where this bill will start? Again, I tend to think this is not something they're gonna move in an election year. Because if the politics are as bad as some analysts have said, then that's something you just wouldn't do in an election year. So I actually think if they're going to do it at all, it needs to be this year, before the end of the calendar year. And of course, this is a busy year. In September, they've got another spending fight. They've got the debt limit. They've got some other bills that are expiring. They want to do tax reform this year. I mean, there's still a lot going on, and it may not feel like the year's almost over, but the summers are generally a slow period. They're gone all of August. They're gone for July 4th. They're gone for Memorial Day. They're gone this week in the House. before you know it, it's September, and they've got 3 or 4 weeks of September to get a lot of things done before some deadlines hit. So, it may seem like there's still a lot of time, but time is definitely wasting away.
And you brought up tax reform. This is another key piece of the Trump 100-day process, or what?
Yeah.
It was a key priority for Trump, and I know members of the House and Senate, and even the White House. The key to getting true tax reform was getting Obamacare repealed and replaced. So, do you anticipate much movement on tax reform right now?
Yeah, I think it's clear that Speaker Ryan wants to pivot to that right away. He's spending part of the recess period this week in the House, traveling the country, working on tax reform, talking to business leaders, manufacturers, and other people. I know he's going to Ohio, I think, today or tomorrow. So I think you are going to start to see the House really move it. And this is where Ways and Means comes in. Our Houston area Congressman Kevin Brady is the Ways and Means chairman. He's now going to be one of the key leaders to try to move this through the committee and try to get it to the floor. I think the August recess is a decent timeline, perhaps, for tax reform, but there's just not a ton of legislative time before the August recess kicks in, so it could be a fall legislative item as well. And keep in mind, once that happens, it's the same problem you have with Obamacare. It's still got to pass the Senate. The Senate's going to do their own tax reform bill. So tax reform, I think, will be next year, just because now the Senate is going to be consumed by health care, and they weren't really counting on health care being a big part of the legislative calendar this year because they did not believe the House was going to be able to pass anything. And, of course, you have to add to that, Chad, the fact that they haven't passed the budget yet. And in order to use reconciliation, they have to pass a budget before they can pass tax reform. So it has to go health care, budget, and then tax reform. I mean, this is all very complicated. It gets down in the weeds, but the sequencing here matters in terms of the outcome. Yeah,
absolutely. Let's see. Let's move on to the legislature real quick. I know we're coming up to some important dates. I had Representative Dustin Burrows on earlier this morning, and it's crunch time down in Austin for lawmakers. Governor Abbott, I guess the big win so far, you can say convention of states, but the immediate big win, I think, is on sanctuary cities. How do you think this plays out for Republicans and for Abbott moving forward?
Yeah, look, the end of the session is in sight 3 weeks from today. Memorial Day will be the end of the session, and so there's not a ton of time left. And there are deadlines. There are key deadlines for bills. That they literally can't move if they hit certain deadlines. So we are getting close to that period. Obviously, there's still some disagreement over the budget. There's a conference committee between the House and Senate trying to work out the differences on the budget, and that is something that could potentially cause a special session. I think they're likely going to avoid one. But those differences still have to get worked out. I know there was work on that late last week, and they'll consume a lot of this week as well. But you're right. Sanctuary cities is a victory for Abbott. I mean, if you look at his emergency items, he had 4 emergency items. It's clear now he's going to get at least 3 of them. And ethics reform passed the Senate in its entirety, and part of it has passed the House, although not all of it. Some of it's been watered down. So you can say he has 3 or 3.5 of his 4 emergency items look likely to pass unless ethics gets done here in the next week or so. So, generally, he's got to be pleased with this legislative session because he's getting most of what he said he had to have. Now, there's still some other legislative priorities that are kind of hanging out there. But for the big items, Abbott has to feel like he had a good session because ultimately he's getting what he said he wanted from his emergency items.
Let me ask you your opinion. Everyone likes to talk about who the most conservative is, the House or the Senate. Taking a look at just what we have right now, is there a huge difference in the conservative pieces of legislation that have passed out? Is there a huge difference between the House and the Senate as we get down to the end of things?
Well, yeah. I mean, look, I think if you look at priorities that the grassroots cares about, the Senate moved them and they moved them early. And there hasn't been a lot of conservative angst over legislation in the Senate. There's a couple exceptions, perhaps on the Warren Buffett carve-out bill or a couple other things here or there, but for the most part, the Senate has been fairly conservative, and I would even say very conservative, and honestly, it's been as conservative as it's ever been. House, moved a lot of other types of bills early. They moved CPS reform. They moved more money for education early. They moved some other, things that they really, sort of business-related type items rather than sort of grassroots type items. Now, the House doesn't like to be defined or described as not conservative, and I think they're probably more conservative than most than Republicans in a lot of other states. But in Texas, they're not as conservative as the Senate, And I think a lot of frustrations with the Senate that bills get bottled up, they get slowed down, they get watered down, they don't move at all. We've seen a lot of examples of that this session and in past sessions, and I think that's a legitimate criticism.
Yeah. Matt, tell folks about the podcast you have, the current podcast you have up right now, and where they can get your newsletter as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Latest episode of the Mac on Politics National Politics Podcast, produced with the Washington Times, is a fascinating episode with Garrett Graff, the author of a new book called Raven Rock. He goes back 50 years and details the federal government's plan to survive nuclear war with secret bunkers and secret facilities all over the country and all kinds of planning. It's absolutely fascinating. His book just came out. It's a great episode. I think you'll really find it interesting. My morning email can be subscribed to at mustreadtexas.com. It's the top news and opinion from around the state of Texas every weekday, sent to you around 8 a.m. every day.
All right, Matt, as always, appreciate it, and have a good week.
Thanks, Chad. Take care.
That's Matt Mackowiak. You can check out his Twitter account, Mac on Politics, and at Matt Mackowiak.